Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Curtis, faculty member in the Department of Natural Resources. It gives me great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Heidi Henrichs. Heidi is an MS candidate in our department. She's been working with me for several years on a bird damage project, the fruit crops funded by the USDA Specialty Crops Research Initiative. Heidi got her undergrad at University of Vermont and did a senior honors thesis there looking at black-throated blue warblers at Hubbard Forest. And so I'm not going to take any more of her time and let her dive right in and talk with us about data she collected for her master's.
All right, as Paul said, my name is Heidi Henrichs. I'm here in the Department of Natural Resources, and I looked at bird damage in fruit crops. The title of my talk today is Connections Between Birds, Fruit Crops, and the Agricultural Landscape, and Implications for Reducing Bird Damage. First, a brief overview of what we're going to discuss this afternoon, and I beg your forgiveness for my voice. I'm going to go over a full project scope on the USDA project that I worked under, as well as a little bit of background information, looking at some overall methods for the project, and then we're going to talk about bird damage in general, several of the deterrent trials that we tried in Michigan and New York State, as well as what happened during our bird observations, some overall issues that we encountered throughout our project, and a little bit of discussion for future steps. First of all, I'd like to point out our partners in this overall USDA project. Along with New York State and Cornell University, we had Michigan State University, and in the Pacific Northwest, we had Trinity Western, Oregon State, and Washington State University. We also had some work done at USDA APHIS at the National Wildlife Research Center in Colorado. So I just want to point out that the overall objective of this project was to identify the best bird damage management strategies and look through several different lenses on how to identify that. Overall, we decided to focus on four different focal crops, being blueberries, sweet cherries, Henrichs apples, and wine grapes. And those four were chosen because those are high-value, fresh market fruit that are, most of them are mid-season ripening, which helps with ease of fieldwork, and they're present in all of our states. So in order to identify a bird damage management strategy that was both cost-effective and bird-friendly, we had to look through several different lenses. The first of which is economic, where we wanted to quantify the cost of bird damage to producers, consumers, and regional economies. The second step, which looked at consumer habits, so identifying whether there was any basis for any kind of marketing strategy going forward when growers are thinking about their bird management strategies. And the third is biology, where we looked at the spatial landscape. So is there an effect of the surrounding landscape on different bird damage within crops? And is there an effect of the different edges around different crop fields? As well as looking at different bird species and their foraging behaviors, and testing potential deterrent techniques. These last two are what I focused on here in New York State. So first, I just want to give you a brief overview of some of the economic data that we've collected. So there was a paper that was published this project in 2013 that showed that there was $189 million lost annually in the United States through these different four focal crops in our important fruit-growing states, which include California, Michigan, New York, Oregon, and Washington. And I would like to point out that these 5 states combined produce over 70% of our fruit in the United States. In New York State, right here, we lose $16 million to birds annually in our 4 focal crops. But through preventative measures, we're already, through proper bird management practices, we're already preventing $25 to $28 million in losses. That is to say, if no one did anything about birds right now, there would be a loss of $25 to $28 million in our New York State economy. So, for those that aren't aware, what I mean when I say bird deterrents is what you're using to keep birds away from certain things. In this case, it's fruit crops. So some of you are familiar with your standard scarecrow. There's a scare eye balloons that people use, a fake owl effigy, pie plates, there's mylar shiny tape. People always also use pyrotechnics, a shotgun for both scaring the birds and to lethally remove them. They also use propane cannons and netting. And netting, I would like to identify as something that has been proven to be effective in the past, but it is a very expensive technique to uphold in your field. So a lot of people, that's not a viable option for them. And these deterrent techniques have been used for a long time. And these and many others have been used for a long time with varying success rates. So moving forward, given that information, we wanted to go ahead and do a survey of what was happening here in New York State on what our growers thought was happening and what was effective in terms of controlling bird problems in our fruit crops. So if you notice on the bottom here, I'm sorry, I forgot to hook up the laser, but on the bottom here is where people think that a technique, if you see a lot of blue, they think that it's very effective at controlling birds in their fruit crops, or if you're seeing a lot of purple, they don't think it's very effective. So for example, all the way to the left, you have chemical repellents. For the most part, New York State growers don't think that it's very or slightly effective method of controlling birds, whereas netting is pretty effective. What we wanted to focus on, because we already knew that netting was working, we wanted to look at auditory and visual scare devices. As you can see, they've got a little bit more on the lower end. And along with this survey, which I will point out was done by Bill Seymour in our HDR unit here in DNR, we also discovered that up to 66% of our growers do take preventative measures to stop birds in these fruit crops, and that 50% say that it's one of the several significant factors affecting their profit on a yearly basis. But most of these growers do enjoy common bird species. They're just afraid of losing profit. In terms of where our work took place, these are our 96 sites in New York State. These are blueberries, cherries, apples, and wine grapes. On all of these sites, we did bird damage assessments. And when I say that, we collected percent damaged and missing fruit, which I'll explain in a bit, as well as looking at the effect of the edges of an area or an orchard versus the interior of it. We also did some bird surveys looking for presence and foraging behavior of different birds. We also used an additional 52 sites in Michigan to combine with our New York data to look at our deterrent trials. In terms of damage assessments, so once we identified different sites and different blocks, we had the growers point out, okay, where would be a nice block that we could assess. And when I'm referring to a block, it's just basically a chunk of an orchard or a blueberry planting or a vineyard that's separated usually by a mown edge. And then within each of those, within each of our blocks, we separated it into 5 different strata. So as you can see, north, south, east, and west edges all were 2 rows around the block, with the remaining interior becoming the interior stratum. And then once we identified the stratum, within each of these we had 12 randomly selected trees per stratum. Trees, bushes, vines, what have you. And then on those trees, bushes, vines, you would randomly select a branch per tree. And this random selection was done so if a cardinal direction would be given a number 1 through 8. So let's say 1 would be north-northeast. So you would choose the branch on that tree that faces north-northeast, which was done through random selection. And then you would also put in the height where the fruit-bearing zone is, and then within those zones of the heights, you would find an interval and locate a branch via that. Once you have your branch in hand, you go ahead and you count all intact, missing, and damaged cherries, berries, whatever, what have you, as well as measuring the length of the branch itself. This varied a little bit so this was the same for cherries and apples, but with blueberries it varied a little bit in the fact that we did similar methods, but given that blueberries ripen over a longer period of time, we decided to do 2 different damage assessments, where you would visit one when blueberries started to blue up but before any were blue, and then you visited a second time when about 50% of the blueberries were blue or before any harvest had taken place, whichever comes first. For grapes, we did a similar thing, but as you know, grapes grow differently. They grow along trellises, so they don't have all the way around. So what we did here was we faced a vine, chose 0 through 6, randomly selected, and then a vertical height in the fruit-bearing zone on 10 centimeter intervals, and then chose the cluster closest to that intersection, And then based on that and practice beforehand, we estimated the percent of the cluster that was damaged due to birds. All of our interns and field workers were well qualified to distinguish between bird damage, mammal damage, insect damage, and other losses. Additional data that we took at each site was we looked at, obviously, site location. We looked at the presence of telephone wires within 25 meters and any other bird management techniques that were occurring in the site. We noted the surrounding land cover from the edge within 5 meters, which usually was, a mown strip, and then also to 25 meters, which could include forest, landscape, or paved roads, or someone's house, for instance. We also looked at number of plants per strata, the height of the plants, and any special notations that were necessary. In terms of looking at the birds on the ground or in the trees, we used point counts to look at the presence of birds in the first 2 years, in 2012 and 2013. These were double observers, and they were 15 minutes long. We basically had 2 observers that would go out to a point. They would wait for a minute so their activity did not disturb the birds, and then they would count all of the birds within a 25-meter radius, circle around them as well as 20 meters above into the air. And they would not share information between one another so that the information that was gathered was not influenced by each other. We also did a point count within the interior and the exterior of the block, which was randomly selected which one went first. Following up in 2013 and 2014, we went further with some foraging observations. The first of which was a stationary count. So the stationary observation had 2 different half-hour periods within a single hour, where a single observer would stand outside the block at least 10 meters, and they would look at a corner of the block with the best view. In the first half hour, they would count any and all birds that were coming into the block and identify the species and the number of individuals, and that was it. Simply getting just a simple count, who's out there, what's happening. The second half hour of the stationary count would be when a bird flew in. They would follow the bird with their eyes and note any special behaviors. Okay, so where did it land in a tree? Is it preening? Is it foraging? If it's foraging, is it pecking at a single cherry a bunch of times? Is it pecking at a cherry and then moving on to a different cherry, or moving on to a different branch, or taking a cherry and moving it out, or taking a cherry and leaving the orchard? You follow a single bird until it goes out of sight or leaves the orchard altogether. I keep saying orchard, but I also mean vineyard or planting. The second part of the foraging observation was a moving observation, which is very similar to the stationary observation where you're trying to follow one bird, but you would be moving silently throughout the block in order to trace its movements and, in order to catch as much of that activity as you can. The idea being that you would move slowly for a half hour through the block, hoping to get sight of a bird and to be able to follow its observation, follow its foraging behaviors. Okay, so going on to results. So the first results that I'm going to share with you are results of bird damage in our untreated repeat sites. So these were sites where we never did any treatment, or they never had any of our deterrent trials taking place in them. So we have data from all 3 years here. I still don't have the layers. But I just would like to note that you could see here that, there's not too much variability except for that first year, the 2012 year. And what happened in 2012 was in late April of 2012, we had major late frosts, which damaged both the sweet cherry and the apple crop, leading to about 90% crop loss in sweet cherries and 60% crop loss in Honeycrisp apples. So we had higher damage levels in sweet cherries. Interesting though, we also had higher damage levels compared to the other years in blueberries as well. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but that might indicate that the natural food supply was also affected by these late frosts, and so they might have turned more towards cultivated crops like blueberries. Damage levels in apples were always really low. So after our first year of 2.2, which was, as you can see, relatively high for the other years, in 2003 we had 0.7%. So following that, we decided to reduce our labors in looking at bird damage in Honeycrisp apples. So we only examined 3 sites in 2014, but still found 0% damage. This could be, One thing I would like to point out is in terms of eating an apple, physically eating an apple, there's very few birds that can actually get into an apple. You're going to think of corvids like blue jays and crows that have a strong enough bill in order to get into an apple. So there's not very many birds that can physically get in there. One thing that I also wanted to look at was damage variation among the strata. So if you look at the different cardinal directions, I wanted to see if there's any patterns that we could discern. I will mention right here, right now, that most of these, aside from blueberries, pretty much all of cherry, apple, and wine grape plantings run north-south, where in the ends of the rows will be pointing north or south. So you might expect some patterns to fall out here. Not too much though. In terms of cherries, we looked at in the north, so I looked at the surrounding land covers to see if they could, hold anything and show me anything in this data. And cherries, the north was mostly deciduous forest, apples or sweet cherries. And in the west, it was apples, sweet cherries, or other tree fruit. In the east and the south, they kind of had the same pattern also in terms of what the surrounding land cover was. So that didn't really show the difference there. In blueberries, blueberries were often surrounded by other blueberries. So in the east, where you see that thing, the majority of the east part of blueberry plantings was more blueberries of a different variety. Excuse me. And that's the same pattern that falls out elsewise. And apples are almost always surrounded by other apple varieties. So there was no pattern there. And then in wine grapes, we did find that in the north there was a lot of mown areas, other grapes, some deciduous forest, and some driveways, which was kind of interesting. So dirt road driveways, so when you're on a farm, there's often dirt, what we classify as dirt roads, where the tractors there's a major tractor or pickup drive. And then in the south, it was grapes and deciduous forest. We did follow this up, and I'm going to point this out later, with a larger land cover study. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Starting off, discussing what we did for our trials. So in 2013, we did a distress collar and hawk kite combination trial. When I say distress collar, what I'm referring to is a speaker system that's run out of an electronic box up to a speaker that's raised above the canopy. It's powered by a marine battery, which is then recharged by a solar panel. Within each of our sites that we had distress collars, we were able to personalize the chips that we used in the systems based on previous year's point counts. So we knew what birds we had seen last year there, and then also the surrounding land cover. So you could base whether you would see a certain kind of hawk there or not, and use those to personalize the chips for each of these sites. When I say hawk kite, this is what I'm referring to. It's a Tyvek material, kind of cut out raptor look-alike, that's very light, and it's attached with a fishing line to a flexible pole that's raised above the canopy. And it's just meant to glide easily with a little bit of wind above the canopy to look like a gliding raptor. So when we were setting out for this trial, we decided that we were going to do groups of 4 because we wanted to look at combinations. So we wanted groups of 4 that would include one site with a hawk kite, one site with a distress collar, one site with a combination of both, and one with a control. So when we were grouping these, we wanted to group them by proximity, so they were less than 30 miles together. Previous year's damage, both from our observations in 2012, as well as grower opinion, and then also whether they were similar size. We set each of these up 2 to 3 weeks before harvest, and we tried to position them more than 4 rows into the block, but if it was a small block, that was impossible. If both deterrents were there, we would set them up opposite of each other. So there's a description you can see. In the upper left is box 1, and the lower right is kite 1. So they would be opposite each other. And then when we moved them, which would be once a week, we would move them so they were opposite. So they're never next to each other in order to cover the whole block. And so for that, we had 28 total sites. When we were going through modeling, we decided to keep it very simple. So we used general linear models in Program R. We used mixed effects models, which allow models with both random and fixed variables. We wanted to use site pairs as a random variable because they weren't independent of each other. Therefore, we had already grouped the sites together, so they were not going to be independent. We used both this group sighting and state as a random effect. And our response variables we ended up having to log transform our weighted overall damage estimates. So this is the results of our distress color and hawk kite trial. You can see from our legend, these are 7 different groups in both Michigan and New York State, and they're positioned by their treatment group. And there's no real pattern here. Doesn't seem like anything worked any better than any other thing. One thing that I will point out is that in the past, it is thought that combining treatments would increase the effectiveness of the other one, and therefore, if you added more deterrents, it would reduce your bird damage more. But as you can see here, it really didn't do much compared to the other ones. That Michigan control, Michigan 2, that control that's very high, it's pretty interesting, and I went and looked through that in the data. There's nothing to indicate why that would have higher bird damage levels than the other groupings. Interesting though, and I'm going to get to it a little bit in my discussion, is why the control groups are so low. Again, we also did an analysis of variance in this, and there was no difference. Okay, air dancers. So this is what I refer to as an air dancer. This is a 20-foot flexible human effigy that waves around. It's powered by an electric fan, which can be hooked up to either a generator or outlet. It waves around. All of them were red, white, and blue. And they either had gold or silver hands or hair. And you can see these guys waving about. So we call them air dancers. So what we did here is we set them up in fields. It's very similar to what we did with the distress colors, and the fact that we, instead of having groups of 4, because it wasn't a combination trial, we just did site pairs, again by proximity, pastures, damage, and block size. Again, we deployed these 2 to 3 weeks before harvest, and we moved these ones every 2 to 3 days, and they were run by a generator outlet. So because we were moving them every 2 to 3 days, we wanted to identify where they could be most effective throughout the block. And so what we would do is we would do a small portion of that stationary observation. So we would go and observe for a half hour before we moved it to see if we could identify any bird hotspots of activity. Otherwise, we would just randomly move it around the block so it had a chance to be everywhere. So with our methods, very similar in terms of modeling of what we did. Again, general linear models and our mixed effects models. And in this case, same thing, so the models had both random and fixed variables. And the site pairs were not independent of each other. We used both paired sites and state as random effects. And our response variables, again, we used that log transformed weighted overall damage estimates. Weighted overall damage, when I say that, I mean, so when we weighted it to include the proportion that each strata had in the total overall size of the block.
So those are proportions or percentages?
They're proportions. And blueberries, we also decided to use a change in berries over change in time, so almost like a berries lost per day. Because as I mentioned before, we have 2 different damage assessments, and so we wanted to go ahead and see if there was a difference, if there was more time in between those 2 damage assessments. So if you had 22 days between the assessments versus 5 days, are you going to see a difference? We also looked at a bunch of different explanatory variables, state, block size, presence of telephone wires, assessment date, which was, we could use both cherries and wine grapes. We looked at the number of air dancers. In 2014, Michigan decided to add some more dancers to their sweet cherry experiment. And then in 2014, we also, in New York State and Michigan, we decided to add more dancers into our wine grape assessments as well to see if we could really affect the damage levels that we see in wine grapes. We also looked at a proportion of blueberries on the second day in blueberries, meaning almost how ripe is that cluster. If there's a lot of blueberries in there, it's going to be a little bit more ripe than one that has less blueberries. Brix, which is a measure of sugar content in sweet cherries. Also looked at netting in wine grapes because a lot of our, especially here in New York State, a lot of our growers are already using nets, but they still want to find other ways that they can keep deterring birds even further. So we had to go ahead and divide them almost in half, whether it was netted or unnetted. and then the year, because in wine grapes we were able to use 2 years of data. So, in sweet cherries, we had these results. A little bit. It worked a little bit. Not significantly. So there was no significant difference in sweet cherries in terms of control groups versus dancer groups.
That seems fine. Isn't the blue and gold really, does not really look different? Like for MI6, it's just not enough.
Yeah, so I haven't explored MI, but we noticed this just recently, the fact that MI6, because they had a couple that were the different group is a little flip-flopped. So that's something that I haven't explored yet.
So did you, sorry,
It's okay.
did you do an ANOVA on this or T-test?
That we just did a pair T-test.
You could have done an ANOVA.
We could have done it.
That might give you more power.
Noted. In 2014, in Blueberry Dancer Trial, we had, we had some slightly significant results. Well, we had some insignificant and some slightly significant results. Sorry, not significant, at least. In terms of looking at percent damage loss as as a response variable, there was not a significant difference between control and dancer treatments. When we looked at berries lost per day, we found a marginally significant difference between the two when we used a paired T-test. And when we looked at wires and blueberries, so again, the presence of wires, one thing that we found that was pretty interesting was that blocks that were near and placed with wires actually had marginally lower damage levels than those that were not near wires. I'm going to talk a little bit more in the discussion about this, but I just wanted to point it out. Pretty opposite of what you believe. And in terms of the models that we found, both blueberries and sweet cherries, both of our null models were our strongest models according to AIC. So we need to kind of hash that out a little bit more. And grapes. So grapes were our little winner over here. So we combined 2013 and 2014 in our wine grape trials. And we did find a significant difference between control and dancer treatments using pair T-tests. And then we also found a model that instead of just being the null model, it actually included treatment and state as variables. Continually to use site pair as a random effect, and using percent damage, or not percent damage loss, damage estimates as the response. So some other things we just want to hash it out. Okay. Next. So this I need to go on a little bit more, and I don't think my wording is correctly here, so kind of ignore the wording and just listen to it. The pattern showed that nets did not help. The presence of nets was not statistically significant difference between the control and the dancer groups. And when you compared netted and non-netted in both control and dancer groups. So I've only looked at the presence of nets in this dancer trial. I have not looked at it in our other trials yet. But it does indicate that there's not a significant difference. Therefore, nets might not be working as well as people think they are. So again, ignore that wording, please. Telephone wires, as I pointed out, they didn't show a difference, a statistically significant difference in cherries or grapes on their presence or absence. But in blueberries, again, ignore that wording, I'm sorry. The presence of wires near a block. Blocks had lower damage levels when there was wires nearby. I'm going to hit on that in the discussion. In terms of birds, what birds do we see? These are our major guys. Cedar waxwings, European starlings, American robins, gray catbirds, blue jays, red-winged blackbirds, and Baltimore orioles. These are pretty expected. This is what you think you would see in these fruit crops. not see as many birds as we wanted to. In sweet cherries in 2014, I will point out that American robin, we saw them the most. They spent the most amount of time eating cherries, and they ate the most cherries that we observed. Cedar waxwings, we saw them the third most, but they were responsible for eating the most and spending the most time eating cherries. European starlings, we saw second most, but they weren't really responsible for spending a lot of time eating, nor eating very many cherries. In blueberries, we see American robin again, but we also get Baltimore Oriole, which is a new one for blueberries. And we only really saw blueberries too much in blueberries. And they were responsible for eating the most fruit and spending the most time eating that fruit. And they were seen a pretty good amount of time. Cedar waxwings, again, they're second place, got that eating a lot and spending a lot of time eating. But we didn't see that many, so the few that we saw spent a lot of time eating. American robin we did see a lot, and they didn't eat that much. Grapes and Honeycrisp apples, we never caught birds foraging in grapes or apples. We saw birds, we just never caught them foraging. So, in grapes, the birds that we saw the most were goldfinch, starlings, European starlings, and an unidentified bird, which most of those were sparrow species. In apples, the only two that we saw were a starling and a turkey vulture. But again, this was in 2014, where we only did 3 sites. Not that the turkey vulture, mind you, was flying over. It was not eating apples. So some points of discussion. Lots of times to photograph when you're waiting for the sunrise. Our combination trial didn't work, so the distress color and hawk kite trial just didn't show the results that we were expecting and were hoping for. Past studies did show varied results, so now we can confidently go forward and say, I don't think distress colors work, and I don't think hawk kites work. And it's interesting that the combination didn't work either, but I'm not going to say that combinations in general don't work. The dancer may work in grapes. So we did show that the dancer had lower damage levels than the controlled groups in both Michigan and New York State. And our growers were just so adamant. They were like, I can tell there's less birds here because there's dancers out. Like, this thing is working great. And so they see less birds, and so I'm happy, and I'm glad that my data showed that. And also one thing that I'm going to hash out in the future is the intensity that we use dancers in gripes. We doubled the amount in 2014, and then in Michigan they actually had 2 sites where they had 3 dancers and 2 sites where they had 4 dancers. So I'm going to hash out a little bit of those numbers to see if the intensity increases much after adding another dancer. So nets don't necessarily significantly reduce bird damage in fruit crops, or in wine grapes in particular. This is something that I want to explore more with some more of my data. Like I said, I only looked at it in my dancer work. And then, the interesting with the blueberries. Okay, so telephone wire. So the presence of telephone wire. So there's lower damage levels in blueberry plantings where there is a telephone wire nearby. But I also went back and I said, okay, which ones have telephone wires nearby? It's these larger blueberry plantings that have them. So I think size might have something that needs to be hashed out a little bit more than actually telephone wires. So the reason, in case you guys picked up on it, that we used telephone wires is because birds use them as a perching mechanism along highways and everything like that. I assume a lot of you have seen it. But overall issues, I mentioned the 2012 frost damage. So we did have those late frosts that really knocked out a lot of crop and kind of messed 1 year of our data. We also discovered that when we counted the total number of fruit in this particularly for sweet cherry. If we counted the total number of fruit that we surveyed, we found that the number of fruit kind of stayed the same, even though the percentage went down with damage. So bird pressure appears similar among the years, even though the proportions are going to change a little bit. In terms of dancer with deployment, we did have an issue where we set up a dancer And this man calls me frantically the next day, or 2 days later, I think. He said, I had to take the dancer down. And I said, why'd you do that? And he said, my dog, he stopped eating. He was crying all the time. He stopped eating, he stopped drinking, blah, blah, blah. So we discovered that maybe if your dog is around, don't put up an air dancer. Or if you have a giant dog problem, put up an air dancer. We also had a little bit of issue with power and generation. So if you're going to use an outlet, for instance, you can only go like 300 yards away from a power outlet when you're generating a dancer, because it does take a lot of amps at startup. And then with the generator, we just use gas generators, so if you could keep them working, that works great, but we did have one that just kept sputtering out every couple of hours that we had to keep restarting. And grower cooperation. So this is something that I want to talk about in terms of where you saw some lower levels, particularly in blueberries, where there was lower damage levels in the control groups. So when we asked these people for permission to go on their sites, these are all private. There's only 2 that were non-private land. When we asked people permission, they gave us permission. Okay, so at that point we give permission. Okay, where can we do this? And they're like, okay, you can do this here and you can do this here. And so we say, okay, are you okay with us putting a control up? Meaning we're not going to try and deter birds. And some of them were like, no, absolutely not. Like, you have to do it here. I'm like, okay. But eventually we would get somebody that would say, okay, yeah, you can put a control here. And then we say, okay, where can we put our control? And they would say, here, you can put your control here. The fact that they chose where that control is, has got to have an effect on our data. Unfortunately, there's no way getting past that aside from really, really hard explanations to the growers, which we did. I think that some of our control groups were truly good control groups. But aside from owning the land yourselves, there's not too much you can do to avoid that. And there are a lot of other confounding variables such as that we need to take into account. In terms of what's next, we do have a lot more land cover data. So in addition to looking at the 5-meter and 25-meter rings around our blocks, we also went up to 5 kilometers on some of our cherry and apple orchards, where we did, we worked, at Michigan State they did this, they used GIS and cropland data to go ahead and look at percentages of different land covers surrounding our blocks. And take that into account, and then also we did do some ground truthing. One of my interns is here, she remembers ground truthing. We just drive around and make sure that is actually happening. So we have that to explore still. We also have a lot of bird foraging data in Michigan that we can still look at, as well as a lot of other collaboration with different manuscripts going both from New York and Michigan and the Pacific Northwest. So we've got a lot more work to do going forward. And with that, we'll take some questions.
All right, great job. So when you're putting together your land use assessment, I was wondering if you'd thought about including the telephone wires in that. You're thinking about the matrix around the patch, and if you don't have a forest, that's where you might have telephone wire.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So potentially the presence of a more intact forest.
You mean like the major telephone wires, like where they sweep through?
I'm thinking of it as a potential explanation for why you see this weird relationship between the telephone wire and the bird damage.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's an inverse relationship between nice habitat for birds in the forest and telephone wires.
Yeah. So most, I'm not positive about Michigan, but for New York, almost 90% of our telephone wires were along paved roads.
Yeah.
So those telephone wires. So yeah, there would be an absence of forest around there.
So maybe it's worth including that in the model.
Yeah. So we in this, what they did, they included not only telephone wires, residential buildings. They also included dairy land.
Okay.
So the presence of dairies, and then what's the other one? Yeah. Also, like water was also included in that kind of stuff.
Wonderful job. I was wondering if you had kind of thought about, trying to assess why it's the grapes that are, the best affected by the dancer. Whether, I was just thinking maybe it's, could be crop height or level of exposure of the birds, because even blueberries are low, like like grapes, but they're clustered in such a way. And I was wondering if you guys had done any conjecturing about why that might have been the best.
Yeah, so I started thinking about it. So one of the major things that I looked at was, like you said, comparing blueberries to grapes. Okay, what's the major difference going on in blueberries and grapes? One thing I can say about New York State blueberries is that we're mostly U-pick operations. So the plantings are a little bit different, and there's a lot of people that move through U-pick operations, even though they're not in my block. So my block, as I mentioned, is a single variety. And the way that blueberries are planted, they're often within other varieties. So they might not be picking in my block yet, but there might be people going around picking. But that's not the case in Michigan. In Michigan, they have vast acreage of blueberries where they machine harvest, just go through the machine. So there's not that human presence. So I thought a little bit more about that. But aside from that, I haven't gotten too much further into what the major difference between, aside from trellising and the way that, the bushes versus the vines are. But I haven't gotten that far yet.
So sort of two methodological kinds of things. So one is on the earlier ones where you're not seeing anything that's significant, I was wondering, instead of doing a log transformation, you might use like a generalized linear model with a binomial family. Since these are proportions,
Right.
that might be better, and it would be less likely to have confidence intervals that go below 0 and so
Right.
forth. But it actually might handle the distribution of the data a bit better. It might find more signals. It's not guaranteed,
Okay.
but that might be something. And I think with the model formulations, if you're using an R in terms of the analysis, it'd be really easy to modify slightly to get what you're looking at. The second was, I said ANOVA, but you were doing actually paired tests on these other things. I think that's great that you set up a paired experiment, because that's really a good way of reducing the overall variation. What you have now with the pairs, though, is you can take a difference, right? And the difference then becomes a univariate response variable that you could then regress against other things.
Right.
Right. So for the size of the, of the area or other things that you haven't taken into account. So that might be something to try.
Yeah, that would be
to
interesting.
tease out some more things there.
Yeah, so in terms of the fact that this is like kind of an applied, I'm trying to keep it simple in terms of who my major audiences are. So we worked with the statistics consulting unit, and she was like, okay, because you're trying to keep it simple, she pointed us towards general linear, but definitely I could try generalized. And in terms of the univariate, that would be a great idea. Yeah.
And one last thing is, so if these experiments are going to go on, continue to go on?
Not at this point.
No, okay. I was going to say you could do a sample size determination to figure out what sample size you needed to make your observations statistically significant.
Yeah, so we originally had tried to, we did identify a sample size, but we couldn't get that in New York. We just couldn't get enough permission, we couldn't get enough sites. Unfortunately, that's just the way it works when you're working with other people's land.
Yep.
I kind of thought that.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
So you focused on birds and bird damage to the fruits, but is there any reason to believe that chipmunks or other small mammals might?
Actually, I did forget to mention, this summer we did follow up with a mammal damage survey, where we set up camera traps in our sweet cherry and blueberry orchards to look at, who it is that's we're seeing actually eat these fruits. And that I think I will be able to present that maybe at our symposium, a little bit of that data. In terms of identification on the ground, you can definitely tell the difference between what's happening with chipmunks and squirrels versus what's happening with, except for in blueberries, because it's more of a loss than it is of a bite mark.
I'm curious about how you're thinking about translating this information into management. And I guess I'm concerned because the natural conclusions say if you find that there aren't so many birds near roads and the damage is less, is to cut down the forest and reduce the number of birds. So I'm sure that's not where you're coming from, but I'm not just being facetious because I lived in the country in California. I'd be riding a horse through neighbors' land and there would be dead birds all over the ground by their vineyard. And Oregon, actually, when I first got to Cornell, I looked at an extension site and had instructions on how to kill native birds, magpies and other things. So I guess I'm asking, what are the laws in New York? It's really interesting that people thought that shooting birds was fairly effective. That probably means they're doing it. And what's your overall sense of how you work with this kind of data and then really kind of mesh it with the human dimensions piece and with management?
So in terms of birds in New York, almost all of our birds are under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which means you can't lethally take it without a certain nuisance permit, is that what it's called? Yeah. So the only ones that are excluded that we really saw are starlings and maybe house sparrows you could take. But for the most part, nobody's really lethally taking here in New York. They will use, here in New York, most of them will use shotguns as scare techniques. I will say that I was shared some information that a couple people did. Just shoot into a flock of birds with real ammunition. But it seems like those flocks would probably be starlings anyways. Not defending my growers. But I think that, like, as I mentioned before, Bill Seymour's work showed that they care about the birds. They don't want to harm them, and most of my growers love nature. They love the environment. They like living on a farm because it's natural, not natural, but it's near natural areas. So I think in terms of management, particularly if you're looking at this telephone wire thing, I think that has more to do with block size than it does with actually development. In Michigan and in the Pacific Northwest, they were able to use more of that dairy data that I mentioned. So the proximity to dairy land. So if you've ever visited dairy, you'll see that there's cows everywhere, but there are also starlings everywhere and other blackbirds everywhere. And they utilize those as different grounds. And so they're having major problems with them using dairies and then coming over and eating blueberries when they're ripe and then coming back. So there's a lot of connection between the two land uses. In New York, we don't have, we do have some dairies, but they're not large-scale dairies, and they're not large-scale, we don't have large-scale farms like they do out west. In terms of our growers, I think that they will take this forward. I know a lot of them have been using air dancers this year. I didn't work this year, but they bought our air dancers. They've been using them, they like that implication. I don't think anybody's gonna take this and stop using distress colors because everybody already owns them and uses them anyways. And even though there have been past studies that have indicated that they necessarily don't work, there also have been a few that have indicated, yes, they do work. So I think that they're already out there and people already have in their minds that they work. It might change a few minds, and that's kind of the goal, is we wanted to kind of make science meet, what's happening on the ground. So hopefully this will help deter some people. And then we can move this forward to find some other techniques aside from dancers, some other novel techniques. So another thing that I didn't mention this talk for time's sake was one of the things that we were starting to think about, starting to dream about, but the technology hadn't caught up to us yet, was the use of drone technology. And so our idea being that you have these quadricopters, that would be stationed at a large blueberry planting, for instance, and then they would have a GPS route where they would just go randomly around blueberries and scare the birds off, and then land back down and recharge, and then do it again every 15 minutes or 12 minutes or whatever it is. That technology is not quite there yet, and the thing that's lacking is actually the charging ability. They can run the route okay, it's the charging ability. So that was kind of our next step in terms of thinking more novel and more like what hasn't been working, what hasn't happened really.
Yeah, that's good, because basically you're looking for things birds don't habituate to.
Right.
So, yeah. Cool.
Someone even mentioned, just off topic, someone even mentioned, if these air dancers are working, why don't you find a GPS, like a little Roomba or something, and move it around the grapes? Right? Any other questions that can answer?
Yeah.
So you cited some studies that actually got at the amount of damage, how much was. Is there enough information in the data you have to do some back and envelope calculations on that kind of stuff to see how much damage is actually done, or do you actually need other things like the number of birds that are there or?
So the economic data, you mean? Yeah, so the academic data was part of this project.
Oh, it was,
So
okay.
we are on the back end of that. So we wanted them to be like, okay, what is happening financially? And then we're like, okay, well,
Right.
what did we, now we can actually calculate. Right now, I could take my data, run it through their models, and say, okay, this year there was this much damage in
Oh,
grapes.
okay, really?
Yeah.
So, does that translate into a value per bird kind of? Well, you know,
Yeah,
I
it would.
it may be a way to allow the farmers to sort of see, you know, what the level of damage is going to do the transaction. I'm just curious.
Right.
It sounds like there's another part of your business doing that.
Yeah, so the economic part is kind of over now, but they still have working stuff that we can keep going forward. And that's where all this collaboration is really helpful, because we have in-house consumer data, in-house grower data, in-house academic data, and now in-house bird data, damage data, you know, et cetera.
Any other questions? If not, let's thank Heidi. We're gonna take-